Good morning. I'm Pete Daly, CEO of the U.S. Naval Institute, and we welcome you to today's conference on the past, present, and future of human spaceflight. Before we continue with our introduction, I'd like to ask us all to stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. For the fourth year in a row, the Naval Institute is honored to co-host this event with the U.S. Naval Academy. The titles of today's panels capture the exhilarating flight: Mercury to Shuttle, Guts and Ingenuity; International Space Station, the greatest human engineering achievement; commercial space flight pioneers. Of course, none of this would happen without the generous sponsorship of the William M. Wood Foundation, represented here by their trustee, Ed Condit. Ed is also joined by his wife, Nancy, and they have been unflagging in their support of this program, which is building in its success year on year. We thank you. We're also very fortunate to have former Secretary of the Navy, Gordon England, with us here today. We extend a special welcome to our midshipmen. Of course, many of you know that the U.S. Naval Academy has more graduates who are astronauts far and away than any other institution. The whole history of the spaceflight program illustrates what you can do with a small number of the exact right people. And I'd like to ask all of the astronauts who are in as participants today, included here as participants and in the audience, to stand up for a moment and just be recognized. The Naval Academy has a world-class aerospace engineering department, and we were very fortunate to work with the department chair, Captain Ken Ham, U.S. Navy astronaut, and Captain Ken Reitler, U.S. Navy retired astronaut. They have been superb in working with us to put together what I think you'll agree is a wonderful program. None of this happens without leadership at the top. And it's now my privilege and honor to introduce my friend, the 61st Superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy, and the person who late last night cut the deal to keep the Navy Air Force game on track. Vice Admiral Michael H. Miller.
Well, good morning and welcome. I'm so pleased to be a part of this once again. The Naval Academy honors this great symbiotic relationship between the Naval Institute and the Naval Academy. We have been joined at the hip for a long, long time. For our midshipmen, I would offer that you should look around and see who is in the audience, because this is such a unique congregation of so many people who, as Pete says, have the right stuff. Would that we could all aspire to be able to achieve half of what they have done. This faculty, some faculty here, I see our academic dean here, who's here since I have stopped paying his salary here this morning. I've got other faculty and staff here. They joined this remarkable group of past, present, and future cutting-edge technicians, scientists, heroes of many, many sorts. It's a long blue line of sorts. Since General Stafford follows me, I'll say it's a light and dark blue line that ties us to a very challenging past and links us all the way to a very uncertain future. I am firmly convinced that it is through these types of interactions that we ensure. This is an investment in the future. It's an insurance policy, if you will. Today, coincidentally, marks the 28th anniversary of Atlantis' maiden launch. She had a total of 33 missions in her distinguished career. She was one of which was out to service the Hubble telescope for me, which was personally a very disappointing mission in that I had long advocated that the rings of Saturn were actually comprised of lost airline baggage. It turns out such was not the case. Nevertheless, I think about all that we have learned from all of these missions, the remarkable accomplishments of our 53 grads combined with all of these other extraordinary leaders in space. I am firmly convinced that this school, as well as many other great engineering and science schools, are today preparing tomorrow's astronauts. I believe that our students, and they're not just astrophysicists, but they are people that are driven, that have the sense of where we need to go, not just the easy, low-hanging fruit, but rather the greatest aspirations of mankind. They are seated here today, and they will figure out not just how to get to Mars, but how to get back. It was mentioned that Ken Ham and Ken Reitler are on the staff here. I'm so grateful to Art and Tammy Dula here, who represent the Robert A. Heinlein Distinguished Professorship Executor, which Ken Reitler, that position Ken Reitler fills here on the staff. Robert A. Heinlein was, of course, a graduate of the Naval Academy and a very famous author, as well as someone who gave me the first sense of the wonder and awe of science fiction. It became science fact in so many different ways. And so if you say Ken Ham, Ken Reitler, pretty much anybody, any astronaut whose name is Ken, I'm willing to hire. In point of fact, I'm willing to hire as many astronauts as we can get on this staff. We're very pleased. Pete mentioned that we have 53 astronauts that are graduates of the Naval Academy, far and away the most. That 53rd was just announced, and so we're delighted that we have a Marine Major Man, who will now join those ranks. So I would offer that while some of us, you'll see the midshipmen have to come and go because they still have some classes, they have some that are now canceled, while there will be a certain amount of turmoil here and I myself can't stay for the whole convocation, I will tell you that the benefit in being able to exchange ideas, to hear what it took to get it right before, should be in so many ways the foundation upon which, the launching pad, if you will, for those that will change the future of our nation. And I'm convinced it's not just locked in legislative bodies. It has to transcend that. It has to be something more than that. It has to be people with a vision who can see things not just as they are, but how they will be. So I thank you so much. We are honored to have so many of our wonderful graduates back here, so many people who have written the history books of this great nation. Thank you very much. I'd now like to bring up Pete Daly again.
Well, our first speaker today has had a storied career. He graduated with honors in the U.S. Naval Academy class of 1952 and was commissioned in the United States Air Force, fighter pilot, test pilot, #1 in his class. He was in the second group of astronauts that joined the space program in 1962. He piloted Gemini 6, and Gemini 6 did the first rendezvous in space. He commanded Gemini 9. He commanded Apollo 10, which did the first flight that took the lunar module around the moon. They picked out the landing site. They executed the whole sequence down to within 9 miles of the moon's surface. On the way back, they set the world speed record, 24,791 miles per hour, roughly Mach 30, a record that still stands today. Maybe one of those flights to Mars will beat that record. He commanded the Apollo-Soyuz mission, and it was the first international rendezvous and docking with the Soviets. He started stealth in the Air Force. He was instrumental in the introduction of the F-117A Nighthawk fighter, the AGM-129 missile, and the B-2. General Stafford has flown 126 different aircraft types. That's for the aviators. I'm a SWO, black shoe, but the aviators love this. 126 different types of aircraft. He's a recipient of the Congressional Space Medal of Honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Wright Brothers Trophy. I introduce today our kickoff speaker, Lieutenant General Tom Stafford.
Thank you, Admiral Daly. Real pleasure to be here back at my alma mater, the Naval Academy, also at the Naval Institute, to talk on your annual history area and to, in a few short minutes, describe the past. And it's going to be talking real fast because there's a lot of past to cover, believe me. And so, ever since recorded history of man, we've looked up at the stars, particularly the moon, and what is there, and how do we get there. And so it really didn't start there with Project Mercury. It started long before that. This was the year 1465 in China. There was a province leader named Wan Hu who had the idea then that he could take these rockets that had been developed and get there. So one day in ceremonial robes on that, he had 47 rockets, and with 47 coolies around him, and gave the command to ignite those 47 rockets, and he would go to the moon. And you can see up here to the moon, and he was on his way. And that shows a stable launch. I'm not sure that all those rockets went through their vector went through the center of gravity. Anyway, there was a few things went wrong. There was a large detonation explosion, and Wan Hu was found no more. Became part of the universe. And I'd never heard of the gentleman until 1965. And that is when the Soviet Union had their Zond 3 spacecraft do a reconnaissance around the moon. And then in 66, it showed up on the Soviet almanac to the moon. And now in the official documentation of the moon, you will see the crater Wan Hu. It's on the back side of the moon, about 10 degrees south, 139 degrees west. So he is well remembered as the first explorer. The next an event that occurred that really shocked America, shocked the world, was in October 1957, Sputnik. Sputnik changed the world forever. It changed this institution. And it was also a very big political fall de rah about it, because the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson, really romped all over President Eisenhower about lagging so far behind the Soviets. And there was a big push by the federal government, by state governments, to enhance science, math, technology, engineering, and all the schools. But it was a continual pounding by Lyndon Johnson and some by Sam Rayburn, the House Speaker, on President Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, for letting the United States get so far behind the Soviet Union, and decided that we'd at least start a manned in space program, the Mercury. We had 2 Naval Academy graduates in that first group of 7, Wally Schirra, Al Shepard, and Mercury was to just have one person in space fly atop of an Atlas D. It started out with a Mercury Redstone, which was really a V2 on steroids, designed by von Braun. It's slightly bigger than a V2, but a lot of the systems are just the same. 4,000-pound spacecraft, and it could only change its attitude in orbit, could not change the velocity vector, had 3 retro rockets that gave enough impulse to get it out of orbit and re-entry. So it first started, and we were trying to beat the Soviets. However, on April the 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin made the first orbit around the Earth on an R-7 ballistic missile designed by Sergei Korolev. And that really activated President Kennedy into action because he saw the great world acclaim. He went to Vice President Johnson, who then headed the Space Council on April the 20th, 1961, and said, what can America do that will put us ahead of the Soviet Union, that will help us scientifically, technically, economically? So with that, the Vice President assembled the best minds he had out at NASA. There was Werner von Braun, Dr. Abe Silverstein of Lewis, Dr. Gil Ruth of Houston, Max Faget, who designed the shape for Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and also the space shuttle, and some other people. They got together, and they reported back to the Vice President. And then in the meanwhile, Alan Shepard flew on the first Mercury Redstone on May the 5th, 1961. It was 200 miles downrange and about 115 miles in altitude. So in less than 3 weeks after that, President Kennedy went before the Congress. Oh, here's the Atlas Mercury. Again, 4,000 pounds. It's an Atlas D. It was a ballistic missile, carried about 3.5 megatons, but it was substituted there. Flew off Pad 14. Here's President Kennedy on May 25th, 1961, making the commitment to have a man on the moon and safely return in this decade. And I'm glad he used the word safely return. But, however, he did it correct politically. The real power was Lyndon Johnson. But also of Texas, he had Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, had Bob Kerr of Oklahoma, Carl Albert of Oklahoma. And so what President Kennedy did was have this small group together and told them before what he was going to say. So while it was a surprise to most of the Congress, to the real power brokers, the deal was already done, and he had it squared away. So this is a lesson in political history. Now, this is the luck of the Irish. When he said, we'll go to the moon and return, there are 3 major technical items that had we not achieved that, America would have fallen flat on its back. The first, we needed a high thrust engine. It's a picture of General Bernie Schriever, the father of the Air Force Space Program, the one that started the Thor, the Atlas, the Titan, our first space satellites, but also it was 1955 he started the F-1 engine. It was a single chamber, 1.5 million pound thrust engine. General Schriever said, yes, thermonuclear technology is really developing, but we still may not be able to get away from a liquid thermonuclear rocket, so he needed a big engine to do that. And those of you who have studied thermodynamics and the stability of combustion, the bigger the engine is, the more susceptible it is for instability and eventually explosion. And they had a continuous of instability and explosions. It took 12 years to get that 1.5 million pound thrust engine ready to go, and it finally flew in 1967. But the Air Force had the engine for 3 years, very heavy resources put behind it. But by then, the breakthrough had come through on nuclear thermal technology, and we didn't need it anymore. They stopped. But Sputnik, also with the effort they had with the Congress beating up on the Eisenhower administration, started 2 major decisions. One was to start ARPA, now named DARPA, and we all know the great resources come out of there to take long leaps in technology, and they formed NASA out of JPL, part of the rocket, Army Ballistic Missile Agency, and the old NACA. So those are 2 major things. Here's the F-1. You've seen probably over at the Aerospace Museum. You've been to Kennedy Space Center, Marshall, and Houston. We have the F-1s there mounted on the Saturn V. 1.5 million pounds of thrust. It was a great engine and did a great job getting us out. The Soviets could never have a big thrust engine. Now, here was the Soviet. The Soviets approached the moon with 2 different types. One was to take their proton booster, which is the heaviest one they had about 45,000 pounds to low Earth orbit, approximately the same as our Delta IV, and they would take a stripped-down Soyuz booster they'd developed. Well, you go over to the Air and Space Museum, you'll see the Soyuz dock to my backup spacecraft, the Apollo with a docking module, and they take away the orbital module, which is around the version where they live most of the time in front. And so without that weight, a proton could shoot it in a free return trajectory around the moon as it came around, and say the Soviets have been to the moon. And that way, so that was one they had. This was the second, the N1 booster. And again, they could not have a big booster, so they had 30 engines on the first stage. It was a plumbing nightmare, 60 pipes leading fuel and oxidizer in. They had these 6 engines were for roll engines. The outer ones, which I'll still never understand, was used for yaw and pitch. And but also it was a real logistic nightmare. This engine, this booster was assembled in Moscow, taken apart into small pieces, put on trains, shipped 2,000 miles an hour to 2,000 miles to Baikonur, and then put back together. Any of you ever had any experience with maintenance on aircraft or ships or anything? You know, when you take something apart and put it back together, you're going to make mistakes. And there's no doubt with all the parts they had there. And again, they had, we made another decision too in 61, again before Clinton, 59, and that was that all for exploration. The upper stages would have liquid hydrogen as the fuel versus kerosene. An example, probably the best specific impulse we have out of kerosene and liquid oxygen is 300 seconds. Hydrogen and oxygen is around 450 seconds. So you have 50% more specific impulse using hydrogen. But here, what they had all up through here was kerosene. And even though it had nearly 10 million pounds of thrust, weighed slightly less than the Saturn V, it could only put about 200,000 pounds in orbit, where the Saturn V could put nearly 300,000 pounds in orbit. And as Jim Lovell knows, we needed all that weight we had to get up there. Here's the Saturn V. This is showing what America can do. From the time that Kennedy said go in 61, we had sand dunes, palmetto trees, palm trees, rattlesnakes, alligators. That was all cleared out. The biggest building in the world was built, the 2 largest launch pads, and this was launched successfully. 6 years and 6 months from go, and that was it. Today it'd take you 6 years and 6 months to get the environmental impact statement. All right, here was the third key to what made a success. The 2 major proponents on how we would approach this was von Braun out of Marshall Space Flight Center to do an Earth orbit rendezvous with 2 large boosters, each one weighing between 10 and 11 million pounds into a central booster, and then go direct to the moon and back. Dr. Gilruth from Houston wanted to have a big booster weighing probably 14 million pounds, and that would go direct and back. So that would take at least 10 to 11 of those F1 engines just to get you off. But there was an engineer at Langley, Dr. Hubolt, who had said what he thought was the right idea. He was driven. Now this is an example for the midshipman. When you do have a good idea and you know it's good and it has sound things, you got to push for it. He continued to push, and so finally he made an appointment and drove up to Washington, had a meeting there with Dr. Siemens, and convinced him that the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, which is described here, is the way to go. Here he drew out the command and service module, and this is exactly what we did. So we were able to go from the one idea of 14 million pounds, another one to about 10 to 11 million pounds, down to one vehicle, 6.25 million pounds. So it made it feasible to go. But without those 3 items, we would not have made it. Next. Now, we had Project Mercury. After John Glenn's flight, Scott Carpenter went there in May. He had 3 orbits, just like John Glenn. He was a little late on some procedures, landed a couple 100 miles long. Later in October, Wally Schirra, Naval Academy grad, had 6 orbits, and landed very successfully in the Pacific Ocean. Then in early 73, Gordon Cooper had a mission of slightly over a day, and a lot of the systems failed, but he was able to bring it home, man. He did a great job. That ended it. But here we had Mercury that could only change its attitude, and here we had Apollo to go to the moon. We needed a bridge. And the bridge had to be something that could give us, to show rendezvous, show how we could walk in space, how we could have precise guided reentry. So this, again, is another good example for you. There was a one-page request for proposal written. It said it would be a spacecraft containing 2 astronauts, have an onboard computer, radar, could perform rendezvous, docking, extravehicular activities, and have up to 14 days in space, which Jim Lovell can testify to, and then also have precise guided reentry to a precision point on the Earth. And so there it was, one-page piece of paper. Now, you can very easily have 200 to 300 people write documents this thick and have the same RFP. And this is what, unfortunately, I think we have today. We have too many people writing too many documents with too many requirements on it to get there. And that is why it takes us so long and costs us so much. Here's Gemini. We had, a lot of it was designed by Jim Chamberlain. It was McDonnell Aircraft won the contract. A lot of it was designed by Jim Chamberlain, who came from Canada, a great engineer. And here we have the reentry vehicle with the 2 astronauts, slightly more room than Mercury, not a whole lot. Back here is the adapter section, and we have the roll, pitch, and yaw thrusters, 25-pounders. And here was the fuel oxidizer. This is the retro section. And in that retro section, we had the plus and Y and the Z thrusters, 100-pound thrusters. We had 2 minus X thrusters. We have 2 positive thrusters. X thrusters, parachutes up here. Here are the entry control system, 25 pounds. And the radar's out in front. There's 8,000 pounds approximately, and that replaced the Mark 6 reentry vehicle that came the W-53 warhead that had 9 megaton warhead. So it went from 9 megatons to the Gemini on a Titan II. We also had to make a series of modifications to it to put the emergency detection system on, because there was a series of items we thought would not completely enhance thorough safety on the Titan II. Turns out the Air Force adopted quite a few of ours. Now, the first flight occurred there in March of 1965. Gus Grissom, John Young, Wally Schirra and I were the backup. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how much the Soviet Union played on our program, but also how much our program drove the Soviet Union. And there was Khrushchev, the secretary of the Communist Party. He was pushing their chief engineer, because our schedule had been published a year in advance, said we have to have somebody do a spacewalk, EVA, extravehicular activity, before the Americans do it. So here is Leonov. He went out there on Vostok 2, which occurred 3 days before the Gemini launch. Our crew happened to watch it, and it showed him floating out in space. He went out for about 10 minutes, said everything is fine. Well, later, as I got to know Alexei could speak some Russian with my Oklahoma accent that he could understand, that turns out he nearly got killed. His suit ballooned on him, and he couldn't get back in this makeshift airlock that was pretty ingenious. But they did have a good feature that we don't have in our suits. You can let some of the pressure out of the suit. It's a very dangerous situation, and you have to be very careful what you do. But he let the pressure out and got back in. And even though they were supposed to be atheists, he told me in Russian, thank God he made it. Now, originally under the schedule, not that any schedule will hold firm, I was to do the first spacewalk on Gemini 6. Very simple. Just open the hatch with a double-length hose, stand up, maneuver around a little bit, get back in and close the hatch. But because the Soviets did it, then we had to respond to it. So real fast on Gemini 4, they had Ed White go out on a 25-foot umbilical and with a makeshift little chest pack to flow oxygen. That's all it had. And it was a squirt gun for possibly control attitude. And he was out for 22 minutes. Everything was going all right, except with that type of suit, it ballooned. It balloons this way, which you can probably work with in Gemini, but also it ballooned vertically. And Ed, you had to do kind of a double whammy to get back in that spacecraft. He could not get the hatch closed. And Ed's heart rate went over 220 beats a minute. He finally made it, fortunately. And, but from that, they came up with a simple device that probably precluded us from a disaster on my second mission, Gemini 9. So an over-the-center mechanism is an aluminum I-beam with a steel cable where the commander can take and push like that and close the hatch where it's level, but still the pilot has to ratchet it home. So we had the next flight, Gemini 8, that occurred there. Well, no, this is Gemini 4. Then we had to do the first rendezvous in space. Had 2 Naval Academy grads, Wally Schirra and myself, and we were at a rendezvous with an Agena. The Air Force made a mistake, and on their Agena, they had violated the principle on any rocket engine. You always lead with your fuel first and followed by the oxidizer. If you lead oxidizer first and followed by the fuel, there's a good chance you're going to have an explosion. And that's what they had, and the Agena blew all over the Atlantic Ocean. So, anyway, we recycled. The idea came up that we would take Gemini 7. It was going to be a long-duration mission, Jim Lovell, Frank Borman, to go to 14 days, put a transponder on that, launch them, put Gemini 6 back on the pad, and launch. So we were all set to go. They were in orbit, and it was, and we were supposed to launch on the 12th of December. And that was near the Army-Navy game. And there were 3 Naval Academy grads. Al Shepard, head of the astronaut group, Schirra, and myself sitting around. Maybe we could give the midshipmen a little boost there, and we came up with an idea, since we would be together and they could have a chance to take a picture of us, that we'd have, if the rendezvous went right, that I'd have a little card made up of some kind and have Jim Lovell take a picture of it. So it was Al Shepard that came up with the idea. It was late in the afternoon. We were having a strong cup of coffee, maybe a cup of Jack Daniels, I can't remember. And we had it says beat Army. So anyway, we performed the rendezvous, and it went well. Did a 4-orbit rendezvous, 6 hours. Here's the first space-to-space picture. I shot that out the right window. Jim Lovell is over here in the right seat. Borman's on the other side. He's from West Point. I don't know how he got on board. But here we are. We flew around, got within 1 foot of him. And then we put up, I put up the sign. I told Jim, I said, you know, you've been up here longer than anybody. Doctors are concerned about your vestibular and your visual acuity. They want you to look at this, take a picture, and read what it said. So that is beat Army. In fact, it was so unique, the Washington Post carried it on the front page a couple of days later. And it's somewhere here in the museum. I think it's the Naval Academy Athletic Museum. Now here's the Agena that went ahead on Gemini 8, Neil Armstrong, Dave Scott. This was in March of '66. They finally got rendezvoused with Agena, hooked up to it, and everything was going fine, and suddenly the total masses started to rotate. And where the Gemini had been fine before, they thought for sure it was probably the Agena. They undocked, and the Gemini started to rotate very rapidly. It got up to 1 degree per second, which is very, very fast, believe me. They started to really get red out. And they finally got the thrusters killed, and Neil activated the reentry thrusters, went through one ring of reentry thruster, half of the other one. And so you're getting down near the end. And so that was with that, you've got to come home. So after 8 orbits, they came home and landed in the Pacific Ocean. So that was a close one. So we had 2 of them there that were very close. In Gemini 6, I didn't mention that when we finally did get ready to go on December the 15th, T-minus 3 seconds, the engines lit off, and exactly T0, the engine shut down. We had the liftoff signal. And we knew we had a dead man's curve about 3/4 of a second. But yet we knew we hadn't lifted off, and a fire broke out down below. And so I was quoted as saying, "Ah, shucks." But anyway, here they rendezvoused. Scott shot this picture out of the right window. And then they had the spin up, which was really a close call. They got out. Those are the two close calls we had in Gemini. All right, second mission, Gemini 9. I'm emphasizing 9 because the rest of them can be picked up on the panels. I'm covering all this in a short period of time per Admiral Daly's direction. And so we were to do 3 different types of rendezvous. One's a third orbit rendezvous, would be the standard we'd do around the moon. One is an overhead rendezvous to simulate a command module coming down to pick up a disabled lunar module. And the other one is an optical rendezvous. We did the first optical rendezvous. And to fly an Air Force experimental pack there with a rocket pack. Now that was a real leap to go from Ed White's 22 minutes to this thing. We had an improved chest pack, but still just a little water boiler, no liquid cooled garment, hydrogen peroxide thrusters on it. And John Young had a saying one time. He says, "My, weren't we brave, but my, weren't we dumb." And we didn't even think about putting defog on the visor. And he was having a very hard time controlling himself. There were no real handholds around here. We did have a little ring coming down the back of the Gemini. But this was locked on to the back. He got back there, and as soon as the sun went down, he fogged over. So Gene Cernan basically became blind hanging on to the back end of Gemini. And we did have communication, so I was down to 2 steps to throw the switch to cut the pack loose, and it would be tethered, and 125-foot tether. But said unless the fog burns off and 10 minutes after the sun comes up, we're calling it quits. And again, we didn't have continuous communication. We did get a couple-minute pass over a site in Australia, then down over the South Pacific Ocean below Hawaii. So we had about 30 minutes with no comm. And it gets lonely out there with the hatch open and your buddy's hanging on the back, you can't see. And the sun came up, he didn't burn out, so we're calling it quits. But yet he couldn't see to get out. So he had practiced unhooking. He had a convex mirror he'd put on a docking bar, so I could look at that and tell him to put his hand and slowly work his way up down the back of the Gemini. He got up near to the right seat, and I told him to swing his body around, and I'm pressurized flying this. Reach over, grab his boot, get him and turn his face towards the sun, and hope it can burn off. He still was completely fogged over, couldn't see. He came up with an idea that take your hand, put it on the metal ring, and rub your nose, and you might get a little hole to look out. So he did get a hole to look out, but that wasn't very much to see. Now, he still had to get in. By then, we finally got contact over a tracking station in Mexico and told him I was going to get him in before the next sunset. And so he got him squared away, and again, he's blind getting in. I'm kind of trying to guide him in. And his suit had ballooned as much or more than Ed White's. He could not get in. The hatch was still open about this much. So I reached over, grabbed the over-the-center bar, and slammed it home. That pulled the hatch down flat. But still, he had to lock it, and he had to get a hold of the handle. And I had to guide his hand up into a handle, and he started to ratchet it home. But he finally got it ratcheted home, turned up the cabin pressure, he opened the visor, and his face was completely red like he'd been in a sauna bath about an hour too long. So I just took the water gun and hosed him down. You're not supposed to have water in a spacecraft. Cernan lost 10.5 pounds in 2 hours outside. And that is not a good way to lose weight, I'll tell you. And in fact, we landed the next morning, got right near Bermuda, got the suit back to Houston. They poured 1.5 pounds of water out of each boot. So we said, hey, it's time out. We need to find a better way to learn how to work and walk in space. And we'd only used a polished steel table there, 20-foot square to kind of maneuver around. It's still two-dimensional, still not really what's there. And some people came up with the idea of maybe training underwater. So the idea to train underwater came out of the problems that we had on Gemini 9. Now, I know later on, we had Gemini 10 coming 6 weeks behind us, and Mike Collins was going to be the pilot, did not have time to do any underwater training. We didn't have a facility for it. And I know that Jim's pilot, Buzz Aldrin, claims he came up with the idea to have a train underwater. And also we had engineers that had ideas, train underwater. It turns out that Von Braun and his group at Huntsville had developed a big pool, and we're doing somewhat zero-gravity simulation. So for your midshipmen, for your future careers, you will find that when you do have a success, success has many fathers. Failures have none. But we went on, we learned a lot from Gemini. We had the crews that learned how to do rendezvous, and all that technique fed over into Apollo. Now, also, things don't work out right. This was our target docking adapter. There's another point. If you have something that doesn't feel right engineering-wise, you ought to question it, ask about it, really go into it. John Yarley, who managed Mercury and Gemini for McDonnell Aircraft, told us that we had up to 2 to 3 months of fuel. Now, we did use recycling, and we used, that is the Gemini 6 nose section recycle. We had batteries, a docking collar, but due to a series of personnel errors, we had that. And they wanted to describe it. We knew it was rotating, so it was going to be a real task to dock with. When I finally found it, they wanted to describe it. I called it an angry alligator. I also called it a few other names. Okay, we finished out, and I'll let Jim Lovell on his panel talk about Gemini 12 and how they finally, by training underwater, they got it worked out with the right tethers, the handholds, and this, that they could start doing useful work without being overstressed. Apollo. The idea, the name for Apollo came from Dr. Silverstein, the director of Lewis Laboratory back during the Eisenhower administration, just having 3 people and all this before we yet had a commitment to go to the moon. But he had the evidence. All right, we had a tragedy. We're going to have the first Earth orbit Apollo there in January of '67. We lost Gus Grissom and White, Roger Chaffee, and that set us back. In the meanwhile, the Soviets were still pushing that Proton with a cut-down Soyuz on it on a free return trajectory around the moon. And every 2 months they'd fly one. The first stage would fail. The second stage would fail. The guidance would fail. But they just kept after it. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, in the astronaut group, we didn't know anything about that. All we had was just a secret clearance, and I guess some of that was in the intelligence area. Now, General Sam Phillips and George Lowe knew about it, but we didn't. And so from that came, before we even flew the first Apollo, the idea of taking the second Apollo and flying it to lunar orbit for Apollo 8 that Jim Lovell's on. I'll let Jim describe that in his panel. Here's Apollo 7. I was a backup commander to Wally Schirra. We did that in October there of '68. And then here, just 2 months after we flew that for 11 days, we sent Apollo 8 from Apollo 7 to Apollo 8 around the moon for 10 orbits. And Jim can describe that in his panel. It was really it's a risky flight. It was a great achievement. So Americans had been to the moon. We still hadn't landed. We made the picture of the famous Earthrise. When you're up at the Earth, look back at the moon, it's about the size of an orange. Here's my flight, Apollo 12, first flight of the lunar module to the moon. The lunar module was a heavyweight lunar module. It was too heavy to land. We might have had a chance if it was a lightweight lunar module, but also we had to have the descent powered software, which was not developed yet. So our job was to go to the moon, separate the lunar module, go down to about 9 miles, radar map, photo map, pick out the landing site, and do the first rendezvous around the moon. We'd do that 2 low passes, come around. And we did that, and then we'd saved enough fuel and time of year and trajectory on the way back. We set that all-time world speed record that Admiral Daly had mentioned. And one thing we did, we had the most experienced Apollo crew that flew there on a 10, and all of us were experienced. Space looked so beautiful, but yet all we could bring back were just Hasselblad pictures, maybe a little bit of 16-millimeter camera. Said, why can't we have color TV? So let's put together a skunk works. So this was my idea, that we could get some type of a kludged-up color TV. And we didn't have enough time to get a gun that has red, red and green like we have for regular TV. So we got a rotating color wheel like the first prototype. And then we had the light level Vidicon from Vietnam declassified, had the French lens flowing over, and we put it on board about a week before launch. And so the people on the Earth saw color TV of what the Earth looked like. And we were feeling real good, and we're kind of high after that at the end of the first day. And I said, you can tell the British Flat Earth Society that they are wrong. The Earth is round. We went to sleep, put up the windows, went to sleep. Next morning, the spacecraft communicator and a fellow astronaut read up the news of the day, and we did have a message. He wanted Colonel Stafford to know that he saw the beautiful picture of the round Earth, but I was wrong. It's a flat disk. All right, here's a picture of John Young in the command module. We're shot this from the lunar modules. We go above him to get phasing to go behind to start down low. Here's the Apollo 11 crew 2 months later to go to the spot, to the ellipse we'd picked out. We had 3 potential landing sites, and from the high resolution Hasselblads we had, from the visual acuity, I told Neil that we had a chance of 25 to 35% of having an area clear of boulders and craters. Here's my crew. I'm doing the briefing at this time to Neil and his crew about the landing. And finally, July 20th, 1969, had the first step on the moon. And so we carried out Kennedy's goal and beat it by 5 months and a few days. We made it. But without those 3 decisions of having a big rocket engine, having liquid hydrogen in the upper stages, and a lunar orbit rendezvous, we would not have made it. Now, just before then became a unique event, the Soviets had the N1 booster. The first time they tried to fly it, failed. Vibration, they got up to around 35,000 feet, and one of those 60 pipes cut loose, fire broke out, bang, it exploded. The second one, they wanted to show they had flown the heaviest lift, the heaviest thrust booster going. And this occurred in the first week of July. We did not know about this. And so it lifted off, got about 300 feet above the pad. One of the oxidizer pumps swallowed a bolt. It exploded, kicked off, exploded another engine. It shut down and went back down and hit. And that then occurred 2.3 kilotons of energy. It was the largest non-nuclear man-made explosion in the history of mankind. Now, we always talk about kilotons. We go back to Hiroshima, which is 15 kilotons. So what happened when the booster fell back? It was about between 1/7 and 1/6 the power of Hiroshima. And my good friend Alexei Leonov was standing about 5 kilometers away, and he nearly got knocked down. Nobody was killed. A few people got injured by flying shrapnel. The longest piece of shrapnel went about 10 kilometers away. We've seen this picture. Here's Apollo 13. First, we had 12 after that, 4 months after that, to show that Apollo was not a one-trick pony. In October, Pete Conrad and his crew went back, and they did 2 space excursions around for about 4 hours and came back. Then came Apollo 13, and I'll let Jim go into that. One of the greatest exercises we ever had in the space program was getting Apollo 13 back. It's the first time we went to a non-free return trajectory, because when you do this, it takes less fuel to burn into lunar orbit. Jim, you can describe that in your panel. And you do luck out at times. Here's a picture of Jim and the crew tuck of the area there where the oxygen tank exploded. And originally those oxygen tanks were on Apollo 10 and had been removed due to a quantity gauge. And I didn't know that till after we'd gotten around the moon about midnight. The program manager came and says, "Hey, Tom, you lucked out." And so after Jim got back to Ellington Air Force Base, I said, "Hey, buddy, you ended up with my oxygen tanks." And we finished on 14. Al Shepard got to fly after he had a medical condition squared away. He had 2 spacewalks around. But then George Low started this planning even before the first lunar landing to enhance the lunar module, to stretch the tanks out for more fuel, put in water, oxygen, and we also put on the lunar rover. So with that, we could go out and do more geological field examples. We'd go out in a series of loops, and the farthest way the loop would be from the lunar module would be in case that the power would fail, that we could walk back. And that was 16, 17, 15, 16, and 17. I'm sorry I'm going through this in a hurry, but there's a lot to cover in a short period of time. This is a picture of Jack Schmitt chipping away at a rock on that last mission. And then here, the TV camera from the rover vehicle shows the liftoff, the last liftoff we had there in December 72, the time that man went to the moon. Hopefully we can go back one of these days. Now, we had this leftover hardware from Apollo, and so it was natural that we would go, since the Soviets had started their little Salyut space station, that they would go and we should continue on and have our own space station. And that was the 3rd stage of Apollo, of the Apollo Saturn vehicle. And added with that, we have a solar telescope and a docking port. But on liftoff, the micrometeorite and the thermal shield got ripped off, and one of the solar wings got ripped off. And we had a real problem because it started to heat up. It was getting hotter and hotter, and it would ruin the food we had on board for those 3 missions and also decay the insulation, so it would be toxic. So Pete Conrad and his crew had took up through an airlock expandable fishing rods with this aluminized mylar and got it out there. Oops, let's go back one. And they did a great job. And so they spent, to start with, 28 days. The next mission went up, the next Skylab mission went up for 59 days, and the last one for 84. So from that, those 3 missions, that was our first space station. And Crip, you can give them some explanation on that on your panel, since you participated in some of the support activities. Apollo-Soyuz, the last program we had in Apollo, started out with Dr. Fletcher and academician Keldysh in 1970 said, "Look, we've been to the moon, you have your little space station, we ought to get together." And Kissinger, the Secretary of State, heartily endorsed it. And here we see in April in Moscow of 72, President Nixon and Kosygin, President Kosygin signing it, the real power as Brezhnev, Secretary of the Communist Party, behind it. They outlined the fact that we'd do the rendezvous and docking in July 75. And now we run into the Soviet hardline. From you midshipmen just reading history books, it's hard to realize the tension between the 2 countries in the Cold War. This mission was carried out when each country had 6,000 to 8,000 nuclear warheads, strategic, aimed at each other, and we had thousands of tactical nuclear warheads aimed at each other. And there was a continual tension for the ones that lived in that period of time and could understand that. Now, the Soviets, they had a phobia for secrecy, a real phobia. They said, "We will not name the crews until 6 months before." I drew a line in the sand, I went to George Low, I said, "We've got to be there at least 2 months before." So in February of 73, we named our crew. "We're here, where are you?" So right away, the press and the media around the world got on the Soviets. They had to name their crew. So finally at the Paris Air Show in 73, 2 years before the launch, they named their crew Leonov, Kubasov. We started working together back and forth, and we needed every bit of that 2 years. And I sure needed it with my Oklahoma accent, learning how to speak Russian, and for them to understand me too. Here's a picture I'm showing President Nixon, the configuration we had for the Apollo-Soyuz. Dr. Fletcher standing by, Administrator of NASA. Artist concept, we have the Soyuz over here. They flew at sea level pressure. We flew at 5 pounds per square inch. Here's our docking module. You can see the backup docking module over at the Smithsonian. We would shut the forward hatch of the Apollo command module, go in there, shut the back hatch of the docking module, pump it up with nitrogen to 10.2 psi, and then dock with them, and then equalize the pressure, open the hatch. But the way the Soviets went out is something we would never do. They had it disguised as Cosmos. They flew 2 complete Soyuz spacecraft, unmanned, that whole profile before, under a Cosmos. And then I got a call early on January of '75 from Glenn Lenny, the program manager, who had just gotten a call from Moscow. The Soviets launched the backup crew in a Soyuz and went through the whole profile of the mission. If you remember, Kripp, they had Rukavitchikov and Flipchenko did the whole mission, where they went there, lowered the pressure, and then went through the maneuvers they should, and then back, pressure up and then down. And we would never think of that. Here's our crew, Deke Slayton, really happy he finally got to fly Vance Brandon's first flight. Kubasov here, he did the first welding in space, Leonov, myself. All right, they launched from Baikonur, and then 7.5 hours later, when the plane of their orbit came across the Cape, we launched from pad 39B, and I guess I had Bob, I had the notoriety. I did the first launch off of pad 39B of Apollo. I did the last one on Apollo. And here we rendezvous. This is my 6th rendezvous, and we didn't have any problem at all. It should have been a piece of cake, and it was. Came in. I spoke Russian to them. They spoke English to me, and we got along real well. And here comes finally the end of the space race, simplified there when I shake hands there with Alexei. Now, one thing, we did have to have a little bit of fun with him. We'd train together in mock-ups and all that, and oftentimes I'd knock on it and he'd knock off. So we were ahead of schedule, so I was up there. I knocked on the hatch. I heard the knock back, and I said in Russian, "Kato bude tam?" Who's there? So we did have a few little laughs, and Kripp, you were there with us and did a great job on the support crew. You can fill in on your panel about that. And we signed the documents. They're over in the Smithsonian. You can see that, put that together. And that ends it. Now, Admiral, I'm sorry if I've run over. I'm sorry.
That's terrific. That's terrific. I thought, why don't we take like 2 questions? Okay. We ran a little bit over, but we do have time for 1 or 2 questions for General Stafford. There are mics up there on the concourse level. If you could get to a mic, that would help us a lot with hearing the question for the entire audience. Thank you.
Question? Say, let me bring up one point I didn't get a chance to, because I'll apologize for covering such a big area in such a short period of time, but one thing came up that midshipmen can learn later on what happens when you're in command. Before we flew Gemini 9, we were suiting up in the room. I was about suited up in my little room in this, mobile home we had. Gene was suited up. Deke Slayton comes in and tells the suit tech out, and I'd just about finished suiting up, and he said, "Tom, NASA management's decided, this is going to be the first spacewalk around the world. He's going to be out in that rocket pack. If he dies, you have to bring him back. We cannot have a dead American astronaut floating around out there." And I says, damn, Deke, here we are less than about 2 hours before lunch, and you bring this subject up? I says, we have never, ever discussed that before, or what is the ramifications? I said, I'm pressurized in this little Gemini. I can't get out of this thing to go try to get this dead body in a pressurized suit out and then try to stuff him in a spacecraft. So that's out. I've got to come in with this hatch open with this lanyard out. And here, again, Gemini did not have an autopilot for retrofire. The only autopilot we had, you could go small end forward, blunt end forward, and that's it. And the commander had to fire, control all the attitude maneuvers. So I said, here I've got, the 200-pound Cernan out here. I've got a 200-pound backpack on a 125-pound tether, so I've got a huge moment arm. And can I get the vector in of those 4 retro rockets to get the Delta V in to get out of orbit? And suppose I can get enough to get an entry to the atmosphere. That hatch has still got to be open to bring him back in. And then right here, I've got this one-layered suit of nylon with a rubber garment inside and a comfort garment. And I've got 3,100 degrees that far from my shoulder. How long do you think that suit's going to last, Deke? And Deke just looked at me. I said, then suppose I make it through that by some unknown miracle. We come down, we start to put the parachutes out. They're still going, with all that insulation on that backpack and him, there's still going to be some debris out there, and I could tangle up the parachutes. And then say we get from that, if the parachutes do happen to get out, and we land on the water and the hatch is open. I says, remember Gus, what happened to him, and the hatch went open? And all the original 7 were still a little touchy about Gus's hatch blowing open. I said, I've got a hatch open as opposed to spacecraft sinks. He said, well, what should I tell NASA management? I said, you tell them that when the bolts blow, remember, I'm the commander, I will make the decision. And that's it. Boom. With that, I was pissed. I slammed on my helmet, hit the lock ring, and walked out, picked up my ventilator, and we didn't have communications between the two. We finally got plugged in, so it had been quite a while. And Cernan came to me and said, hey, Tom, why did Deke talk to you so long? I said, Gino, he said he hoped we'd have a real good flight today.
Hello, sir. I'm Todd Pryby, retired Army Warrant Officer. What was the meal for your Soviet Apollo join-up?
Meals?
Your menus, yes.
Okay. We tested the Soviet food that they had, and then in Houston practiced the food we had. When they got up there, they pulled a little joke on us. And for tubes, suddenly it had vodka label on it. And one was standard Stolichnaya, the other one said extra, which means it's kind of aged, like you do bourbon. But when we tasted it, it wasn't vodka, it was just borscht. But Gemini food was kind of yuck, but Apollo got lots better. We had hot water, we could reconstitute, freeze-dried, and the shell has gotten real good.
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to cut it there because we ran a little bit over. But I wouldn't have traded a minute of it, sir, and I thank you and the whole audience with their standing ovation obviously gave you a vote on your remarks and your rendition firsthand of some of the most critical history in the space program. I'd like to give you, as a small token of our appreciation, this Naval Institute Press book, Circle of Treason, about 2 brave female CIA agents who cracked the Aldrich Ames cakes. But I, sir, thank you again for what you've done, who you are, and where you've left us in the history of the space program. Thank you very much.
Admiral Daly, real pleasure.
Thank you, sir.